What if I told you that the woman everyone dismissed as just a supply clerk was the only person who could save an entire military base when enemy forces breached the perimeter? This is the story of Staff Sergeant Maria Santos, and why you should never underestimate someone based on their job title alone. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Tuesday morning at Fort Blackwood Army Base dawned gray and humid, the kind of oppressive heat that made uniforms stick to skin before the sun fully rose. Staff Sergeant Maria Santos walked through the supply depot with the same methodical pace she'd maintained for the past 4 years, her boots echoing against the polished concrete floors as she conducted her daily inventory check. At 31, Maria had the lean build of someone who stayed in regulation shape, not because the Army demanded it, but because discipline had become second nature. Her dark hair was pulled back in the standard military bun, and her CU uniform bore the simple chevrons of a non-commissioned officer assigned to logistics support. The younger soldiers gathering near the loading dock didn't notice her approach. At first, they were too busy complaining about the upcoming field exercise, their voices carrying that particular blend of bravado and nervousness that marked troops who'd never seen real combat. Private Jake Morrison was holding court, his voice loud enough to bounce off the warehouse walls as he gestured dramatically with a clipboard. "I'm telling you, this whole exercise is pointless," Morrison was saying, adjusting his patrol cap with the swagger of someone trying too hard to appear experienced. 3 days of playing war games in the woods when we could be doing real training. What's the point of pretending to defend against an attack that'll never happen? Specialist Carmen Rodriguez nodded in agreement, her own uniform crisp and new, enough to still hold sharp creases. "At least we're doing something useful. Better than counting boxes all day like some people around here." Her eyes flicked meaningfully toward the supply cages where Maria conducted her daily work. That's when Corporal Danny Reeves spotted Maria walking past, and his voice carried that particular brand of casual cruelty that comes from someone desperate to establish their place in the pecking order. "Speaking of counting boxes," he said, making sure his voice was loud enough for everyone to hear, "there goes our resident quartermaster. Santos spends so much time with inventory sheets. I bet she couldn't tell the difference between a rifle and a mop handle." The group erupted in laughter, but Reeves wasn't finished. He was on a roll now, feeding off the attention and the nervous energy of soldiers looking for someone to mock. "I heard she's never even been to the firing range. 4 years in the Army, and she's probably never held a weapon that wasn't made of plastic during basic training." "That's what happens when you take the easy route," Morrison chimed in, emboldened by the group's reaction. "Hide behind a desk, push papers, never take any real risks. Some people join the Army to serve their country, others just want job security. And 3 meals a day." Maria heard every word. Her pace never changed, her expression remained neutral, and she didn't turn her head or acknowledge the commentary in any way. She'd learned long ago that some battles weren't worth fighting, especially when the people throwing insults had no idea what they were talking about. But something caught the light as she walked past a small metal object hanging from her key ring, partially hidden beneath her uniform blouse. It was a worn combat infantry badge, its silver finish dulled by years of handling, attached to a key chain that also held what looked like a small piece of shrapnel, polished smooth by time dot in her small office adjacent to the main supply warehouse. Maria carefully arranged a series of photographs on her desk. The images showed various military installations, but not the clean, organized bases most soldiers were familiar with. These were forward operating bases, temporary structures surrounded by concrete barriers and razor wire, the kind of places where comfort was measured in hot meals and clean water. One photograph in particular drew the eye: a group of soldiers in dusty combat gear standing beside an armored vehicle, their faces showing the exhaustion and alertness that came from months of deployment. Maria was in that photograph, but she looked different. Younger, harder, with the 1,000-yard stare of someone who'd seen things that couldn't be unseen. She opened her desk drawer and pulled out a manila folder, its edges worn from handling. Inside were documents that told a different story than the one her current colleagues assumed. Commendation letters, training certificates, deployment orders, all bearing dates from before her assignment to Fort Blackwood. One document in particular was signed by a brigadier general and contained language that would have surprised anyone who thought of Maria as just another supply clerk, demonstrated exceptional leadership under fire, and instrumental in maintaining defensive positions during sustained enemy contact. The morning briefing was routine, the kind of administrative meeting that made career soldiers nostalgic for the clarity of combat zones. Major Patricia Coleman, the base logistics commander, stood at the front of the conference room pointing to charts and spreadsheets that tracked everything from ammunition stores to toilet paper inventory. Maria sat in the back row, taking notes and contributing when asked, her suggestions always practical and thorough, though rarely implemented. "Santos," Major Coleman said during the discussion of security protocols for the upcoming exercise, "you've been awfully quiet. Any thoughts on the proposed perimeter security arrangements?" Maria looked up from her notes, considering her words carefully. "MAAM, if I might suggest, the current plan leaves some blind spots in the northeast sector. The terrain there provides natural concealment that could be exploited by opposing forces. Perhaps we should consider additional observation posts or patrol routes." Lieutenant Bradley Walsh, fresh out of officer training and eager to establish his authority, leaned back in his chair with a patronizing smile. "Santos, I appreciate the input, but I think those of us with actual tactical training can handle the security planning. Your expertise is valuable, but it's better applied to making sure we have enough MREs and clean socks." The room chuckled at Walsh's dismissive comment, and Maria simply nodded and returned to her notes. What none of them knew was that she'd spent 18 months studying that exact type of terrain in Afghanistan, where underestimating blind spots and natural concealment had meant the difference between soldiers coming home alive or in flag-draped coffins. After the meeting, Maria overheard fragments of conversations as officers filed out of the conference room. Lieutenant Walsh was speaking to Captain Stephen Brooks, his voice carrying the confidence of someone who'd never had his theories tested by reality. "The thing about support personnel," Walsh was saying, "is they think they understand combat because they've read the manuals. But there's a difference between theoretical knowledge and actual experience. Santos seems nice enough, but she's been counting inventory for 4 years. What could she possibly know about defensive tactics?" Captain Brooks nodded absently, more interested in checking his phone than engaging in the conversation. "Probably watched too many war movies. These support types sometimes get romantic ideas about what combat actually involves." Maria continued walking past them, her expression unchanged, but her grip tightened slightly on the folder in her hands. Inside that folder was a citation for the Bronze Star with V device, awarded for valor during a firefight that had lasted 14 hours. There was also a letter of commendation from a Special Forces colonel who'd written that Maria's tactical acumen and leadership under extreme duress saved the lives of multiple coalition personnel. But the most telling document in the folder was a medical report from 3 years ago. It detailed injuries sustained during an IED explosion that had ended her combat deployment and eventually led to her reassignment to logistics. The report mentioned shrapnel wounds, a concussion that had taken months to fully heal, and psychological trauma that the Army had classified as adjustment difficulties following combat exposure. What it didn't mention was that Maria had chosen her current assignment specifically because she'd needed time to process what she'd experienced, to find her footing again in a world where the biggest daily crisis was a shortage of office supplies. Rather than incoming mortar rounds, The afternoon brought more of the same, casual dismissal that had become routine at Fort Blackwood. During the weekly supply meeting, Maria presented her analysis of equipment needs for the upcoming exercise, a detailed breakdown that took into account everything from ammunition requirements to the number of meals needed based on troop rotation. Schedules. Her presentation was thorough, professional, and largely ignored. "Thank you, Santos," Major Coleman said when Maria finished her briefing. "Very thorough as always. Though I think you might be overestimating our ammunition needs. This is just a training exercise, not actual combat." Sergeant First Class Tony Martinez, who'd spent most of the meeting playing games on his phone, looked up long enough to add his commentary. "Yeah, Santos, you're planning like we're expecting a real invasion. It's 3 days of playing pretend in the woods. How much ammo do you think we're going to burn through shooting blanks at college kids playing enemy forces?" The room laughed at Martinez's joke, but Maria didn't smile. She'd spent enough time in real combat zones to know that the line between training and reality could disappear faster than most people imagined. She'd also learned that when you underestimated your enemy's capabilities, even in training scenarios, bad habits formed that could prove fatal in actual combat situations. "Understood, Sergeant," Maria replied simply, closing her laptop and gathering her papers. "I'll adjust the estimates accordingly." As the meeting broke up, she overheard more conversations that reinforced what had become the base's unofficial opinion of her capabilities. Private Morrison was talking to Specialist Rodriguez near the exit, their voices carrying the kind of casual cruelty that seemed to be standard operating procedure. "Did you see how serious Santos gets about this stuff?" Morrison was saying. "She acts like she's planning the invasion of Normandy when we're just doing a weekend camping trip with blank ammunition," Rodriguez laughed. "Maybe she thinks if she acts military enough, people will forget she's never actually done anything military. Some people try so hard to fit in that they forget they're just playing dress-up." Maria walked past them without acknowledgement, but she noticed how they quieted when they realized she might have heard them. It was the same reaction she'd seen dozens of times over the past 4 years, soldiers who talked tough when they thought no one was listening but couldn't maintain eye contact when confronted with the possibility that their target might actually hear them. That evening, Maria sat in her small apartment off base, a modest 2-bedroom place that she kept meticulously clean and organized. The walls were mostly bare except for a few photographs and a shadow box containing military decorations that most visitors assumed belonged to a family member. The living room was spartanly furnished, a couch, a television, a small dining table, but everything had its place. Everything served a purpose. She opened a beer and sat on her balcony, looking out at the lights of Fort Blackwood in the distance. Somewhere out there, young soldiers were preparing for an exercise they thought was meaningless, commanded by officers who'd never tested their theories against reality. They had no idea that the woman they dismissed as a glorified warehouse manager had once held a forward operating base against a sustained enemy assault when the base commander and most of the senior NCOs had been evacuated due to injuries. They didn't know that she'd coordinated air support using nothing but a handheld radio and a map while enemy forces probed the perimeter looking for weaknesses. They'd never heard about the night she'd spent crawling through razor wire to retrieve wounded soldiers who'd been caught in a crossfire, or the morning she'd had to make the decision to call in artillery danger close to her own position because it was the only way to break up an enemy assault. Most importantly, they had no idea that her current assignment wasn't the result of incompetence or lack of ambition, but a deliberate choice made by someone who'd seen enough combat to last several lifetimes and was trying to find a way to serve her country without constantly reliving the worst moments of her military career. The irony wasn't lost on Maria. The same people who questioned her military credentials would be the ones implementing defensive strategies she'd helped develop in actual combat. They'd follow procedures written in blood and tested under fire, never knowing they were using tactics perfected by the quiet woman who counted inventory and processed supply requests. As she finished her beer and prepared for bed, Maria checked the weather report on her phone. Clear skies were predicted for the next 3 days, perfect conditions for the field exercise that would begin tomorrow. She hoped it would go smoothly, that the young soldiers would learn something useful, and that the officers would gain some practical experience in a controlled environment. But Maria also did something that none of her colleagues would have expected. She pulled out a detailed topographical map of the exercise area and spent an hour studying the terrain, identifying potential avenues of approach, noting elevation changes and natural obstacles, and mentally cataloging defensive positions that could be established if the situation required it. It was a habit she'd developed during her combat deployments, the kind of automatic threat assessment that became second nature to soldiers who'd survived multiple tours in hostile territory. She told herself it was just intellectual curiosity, a way to stay sharp and engaged with military thinking, even in her current non-combat role. But deep down, Maria knew it was something else. It was the instinct of a soldier who'd learned that preparation and vigilance were the difference between coming home safely and becoming a casualty statistic. Tomorrow would bring more mockery, more dismissive comments, and more assumptions about her capabilities based on her current job title. But Maria had learned to find satisfaction in knowing that her real value couldn't be measured by the opinions of people who'd never been tested by genuine adversity. Sometimes the most dangerous person in a room was the one everyone underestimated. Sometimes legends walked quietly among ordinary people, content to let their actions speak louder than their reputations. And sometimes, when the moment of truth arrived, they reminded everyone exactly who they'd always been. That Wednesday morning brought the familiar sounds of a military base preparing for field exercises. Trucks rumbled through the motor pool, soldiers checked equipment lists, and the controlled chaos of organized movement filled the air at Fort Blackwood. Maria arrived at the supply depot earlier than usual, knowing that exercise preparation always brought last-minute requests and forgotten equipment needs that would keep her busy throughout the day. She unlocked her office and immediately noticed something that made her pause. On her desk, beside the stack of requisition forms she'd left the night before, sat a small wooden box she'd never seen before. It was roughly the size of a paperback book, made from what looked like reclaimed ammunition crate wood, with brass hinges that had developed a green patina with age. There was no note, no indication of who might have left it or why. Maria opened the box carefully, unsure what to expect. Inside, nestled in faded green felt, was a collection of items that made her breath catch. A faded photograph showed a group of soldiers in desert camouflage standing beside an armored vehicle, their faces dust-covered and exhausted. She recognized the faces. They were members of her old unit, Delta Company, 2nd Battalion, taken during their deployment to Afghanistan in 2019. But what made her hands tremble slightly was what else the box contained. There was a small piece of twisted metal, blackened and scarred, that she recognized as shrapnel from the IED explosion that had changed everything. Beside it lay a worn military challenge coin from the 10th Mountain Division, the kind given to soldiers who distinguished themselves in combat. But it was the last item that nearly made her drop the box, a small digital memory card with a piece of medical tape attached, on which someone had written in faded ink, "Kandahar Fob Charlie, the Night Watch." Maria's hands shook as she handled the memory card. She knew exactly what it contained, and she'd thought all copies had been destroyed years ago. It was footage from the security cameras during the firefight that had earned her the Bronze Star, the night when everything had gone wrong and she'd been forced to make decisions that had saved lives but haunted her dreams ever since. She looked around her empty office, trying to understand how this box had appeared on her desk. The supply depot was secured every night, and only a handful of people had access to the building after hours. Someone at Fort Blackwood knew about her past, knew details that weren't in her official personnel file, and had access to materials that should have been classified or destroyed. Before she could process this discovery further, a knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. Master Sergeant Rachel Kim stood in the doorway, her expression unreadable but her posture suggesting this wasn't a routine visit. Kim was the base's senior enlisted advisor, a veteran with over 20 years of service who commanded respect from soldiers and officers alike. "Santos," Kim said, stepping into the office and closing the door behind her. "We need to talk." Maria quickly closed the wooden box and slid it into her desk drawer, but not before Kim's sharp eyes noted the movement. The Master Sergeant had the kind of observational skills that came from decades of managing soldiers and reading situations that others missed. "I'm not here officially," Kim continued, taking a seat across from Maria's desk without being invited. "But there are some things you should know before today's exercise begins." Kim leaned forward, her voice dropping to just above a whisper. 3 weeks ago, intelligence picked up chatter about potential security threats to military installations in this region. Nothing specific, nothing actionable, but enough to make some people nervous. The timing of this exercise isn't coincidental, Santos. It's designed to test our actual readiness, not just train our people. Maria felt a familiar tightness in her chest, the same sensation she'd experienced before missions in Afghanistan, when intelligence reports suggested elevated threat levels. "Why are you telling me this, Master Sergeant?" Kim's expression grew more serious. "Because I've seen your real service record, Santos. Not the sanitized version they keep in the regular files, but the classified reports from your time with Delta Company. I know what you did at Phobe Charlie, and I know why you requested transfer to logistics after your medical discharge." The room fell silent except for the distant sounds of soldiers preparing equipment in the warehouse. Maria studied Kim's face, trying to determine how much the Master Sergeant actually knew and what her intentions might be. "I also know," Kim continued, "that you've been watching the preparations for this exercise with the kind of attention to detail that suggests you see things others are missing. Your supply requests have been unusually thorough, almost like you're preparing for something more serious than blank ammunition and field rations." Maria chose her words carefully. "I believe in being prepared for contingencies, Master Sergeant. It's better to have supplies and not need them than to need supplies and not have them." Kim smiled grimly. "That's exactly what someone with real combat experience would say. The problem is, most of the people running this exercise have never had their theories tested by actual enemy contact. They're planning for a weekend camping trip when they should be preparing for the possibility that this exercise might become something more than just training." Before Maria could respond, Kim stood and moved toward the door. But she paused with her hand on the handle and turned back toward Maria's desk. "One more thing, Santos. That box on your desk didn't appear by accident. There are people on this base who know exactly who you are and what you're capable of. When the time comes, and I have a feeling it will come sooner than anyone expects, they'll be looking to you for leadership that goes beyond counting inventory and processing supply requests." After Kim left, Maria sat alone in her office, trying to process what had just happened. Someone at Fort Blackwood had access to her classified service records and physical evidence from her combat deployments. Someone was expecting trouble during what was supposed to be a routine training exercise. And someone thought she might be called upon to do more than her current job description required. She opened the wooden box again and stared at the memory card. Part of her wanted to destroy it, to eliminate this physical reminder of the worst night of her military career. But another part of her, the part that had learned to prepare for every contingency, made her slip the card into her pocket instead. The morning progressed with the usual chaos of exercise preparation, but Maria noticed details that seemed to escape everyone else's attention. Ammunition requests were higher than normal for a training exercise. Medical supplies included trauma kits and blood products that seemed excessive for scenarios involving blank rounds and simulated casualties. Most telling of all, communications equipment included encrypted radios and satellite uplinks that were normally reserved for actual combat operations. During the final briefing before troops moved to the exercise area, Maria positioned herself at the back of the large conference room where she could observe both the presenters and the audience. Major Coleman was running through final logistics, but her usual confidence seemed strained. Officers who normally treated briefings as formalities were taking detailed notes and asking specific questions about contingency procedures. Lieutenant Colonel David Harrison, the base commander, addressed the assembled troops with what was supposed to be routine guidance for a training exercise. But Maria's combat-sharpened instincts picked up subtle cues that suggested this briefing was more serious than it appeared. "Ladies and gentlemen," Harrison began, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd commanded troops in multiple deployments. "This exercise will test our base defense capabilities under realistic conditions. I want everyone to treat this training as if it were actual combat, because the lessons you learn here could save your life in real-world situations." He paused, scanning the room with the kind of intensity that Maria recognized from pre-mission briefings in Afghanistan. "Intelligence reports suggest that military installations may face increased security threats in coming months. This exercise will help us identify weaknesses in our defensive posture and improve our response procedures." Private Morrison, who'd been among Maria's most vocal critics, raised his hand. "Sir, are we expecting actual trouble, or is this just training?" Harrison's response was carefully worded but revealing. "Private, in my experience, the difference between training and real combat can disappear faster than you might expect. I want everyone prepared for either possibility." As the briefing concluded and troops began moving toward the exercise area, Maria overheard conversations that confirmed her growing suspicions. Officers were discussing red team capabilities and asymmetric threat scenarios using language that suggested they were planning for more than college students with blank ammunition. Sergeant Martinez was talking to Lieutenant Walsh near the exit, their voices carrying the nervous energy of soldiers who were beginning to understand that this exercise might be more challenging than they'd anticipated. "I'm telling you, something's different about this one," Martinez was saying. "They've got us carrying live ammunition alongside the blanks, and the medical teams are setting up trauma centers like they're expecting real casualties." Walsh nodded, his earlier cockiness replaced by genuine concern. "The red team is supposed to be composed of special operations personnel instead of reserve units. And their equipment manifest includes night vision, communications jammers, and breaching charges that seem awfully realistic for a training scenario." Maria listened to these conversations while maintaining her neutral expression, but internally she was assembling a threat assessment based on years of experience in environments where overconfidence could prove fatal. If special operations personnel were playing the enemy force, and if they had access to advanced equipment and realistic tactics, this exercise could become genuinely dangerous for unprepared troops. The movement to the exercise area took most of the afternoon, with units establishing defensive positions according to plans that Maria had reviewed but not been consulted on. She set up the forward supply point in a location that offered good access to frontline units, but also provided covered routes for resupply and evacuation if the situation deteriorated. As evening approached, Maria completed her official duties, but found herself unable to simply return to her quarters as she normally would. Instead, she volunteered to remain at the supply point overnight, ostensibly to ensure that ammunition and equipment were properly secured, but actually because her combat instincts were telling her that something was about to go wrong. She established a small command post in the supply tent, equipped with communication gear that would allow her to monitor radio traffic from the defending units. It was there, at approximately 2,200 hours, that she first detected signs that this exercise was about to become something entirely different from what anyone had planned. The radio chatter started normally, with units reporting their positions and confirming that defensive preparations were complete. But Maria's trained ear picked up subtle inconsistencies in the communications that suggested all was not as it seemed. References to equipment that wasn't part of the standard exercise plan, movement reports that didn't match the expected timeline, and communication protocols that deviated from normal training procedures. Most troubling of all was what she didn't hear. The distinctive call signs and check-in procedures that should have identified the Red Team forces were absent from the radio traffic. In their place were brief, coded transmissions using encryption methods that seemed far more sophisticated than what would normally be employed in a training exercise. Maria pulled out the topographical map she'd studied the night before and began plotting the reported positions of defending units against the terrain features she'd memorized. What she saw made her blood run cold. The defensive positions were exactly where she would have placed them if she were planning an actual attack against the base. They were tactically sound for repelling a conventional assault, but they were also predictable, following textbook deployment patterns that any competent enemy force could anticipate and exploit. More concerning was the realization that the Red Team seemed to be operating with intelligence about the defensive plan that should have been classified. Their movement patterns, as reported by defending units, suggested they knew exactly where observation posts were located and which routes were being patrolled. At 2,300 hours, Maria made a decision that would have surprised everyone who thought of her as just a supply clerk. She activated her personal communication gear and began conducting her own reconnaissance of the exercise area, using skills she'd learned during night missions in Afghanistan to move undetected through terrain that was now filled with soldiers who had no idea they might be facing a genuine threat. What she discovered during the next 2 hours would change everything. The Red Team wasn't composed of military personnel playing enemy forces for a training exercise. They were actually enemy forces, using the cover of the exercise to conduct what appeared to be a reconnaissance in force against Fort Blackwood's actual defenses. The wooden box that had appeared on her desk wasn't a mysterious gift from an unknown admirer of her service record. It was a message from someone who knew that Maria's combat experience would be needed when the exercise became real combat. Someone had been trying to prepare her for a moment when her true capabilities would be tested once again. As she crept through the darkness, observing enemy positions and listening to their communications, Maria felt the familiar mixture of fear and clarity that had sustained her through multiple deployments. Tomorrow, the soldiers who dismissed her as a washed-up supply clerk would discover exactly what kind of person they'd been underestimating. The exercise was about to become a real fight, and Maria Santos was the only person on the base who had both the experience to recognize the threat and the skills to do something about it. Thursday morning arrived with an eerie stillness that made Maria's skin crawl. The usual sounds of a military base waking up were absent, replaced by the kind of unnatural quiet that she'd learned to associate with imminent danger during her deployments. As she made her way through the supply depot, Maria noticed that several of her colleagues were moving with the jerky, nervous energy of people who sensed something was wrong, but couldn't identify what. The mockery that had become routine over the past 4 years intensified as news spread about Maria's late-night presence at the forward supply point. Private Morrison was holding court near the coffee station, his voice carrying that familiar blend of ignorance and malice that had characterized his previous commentary about her capabilities. "Did you guys hear that Santos spent all night at the supply tent?" Morrison was saying, stirring his coffee with exaggerated motions. "I guess she wanted to make sure nobody stole any paper clips or toilet paper while the real soldiers were doing actual military work." Specialist Rodriguez laughed, but there was a nervous edge to her amusement that suggested the previous night's activities had left everyone slightly on edge. Maybe she was scared to sleep alone in her quarters. Some people just aren't cut out for field conditions, even when it's just training. Corporal Reeves joined the conversation with his usual talent for finding the cruelest possible interpretation of any situation. I heard she was on the radio all night, probably calling headquarters every 5 minutes to report that everything was normal. That's what happens when you put someone with no field experience in charge of anything important. Maria listened to their commentary while conducting her morning equipment check, but this time their words carried a different weight. These soldiers had no idea that their dismissive jokes were about to be tested by reality in ways they couldn't imagine. They were making fun of someone who had spent the night identifying genuine threats while they slept, peacefully in their defensive positions, unaware that enemy forces had been conducting reconnaissance of their positions. The morning briefing was scheduled for 0800 hours, but when Maria arrived at the conference room, she found an atmosphere of barely controlled tension that had nothing to do with normal training exercise procedures. Major Coleman was standing at the front of the room with Lieutenant Colonel Harrison, both of them studying a map with the kind of intensity that suggested they were dealing with something far more serious than simulated combat scenarios. Officers who had been dismissive and confident the previous day were now asking detailed questions about ammunition supplies, medical evacuation procedures, and communication protocols with higher headquarters. The change in their demeanor was so dramatic that even the most obtuse soldiers in the room could sense that something fundamental had shifted overnight. "Ladies and gentlemen," Harrison began, his voice carrying an edge of steel that Maria recognized from pre-combat briefings. "We've received intelligence reports suggesting that yesterday's exercise may have been compromised by hostile forces, conducting actual reconnaissance of our defensive positions." The room erupted in nervous murmurs as soldiers tried to process what their commander was telling them. Lieutenant Walsh, who had spent weeks making jokes about Maria's supply expertise, raised his hand with a trembling voice. "Sir, are you saying that the Red Team wasn't actually our people? That we were fighting real enemy forces?" Harrison's expression was grim as he responded, "We're still gathering intelligence on exactly what happened last night, but preliminary. Reports suggest that unknown forces used the cover of our training exercise to conduct surveillance of our base defenses. This is no longer a training scenario, people. This is a potential real-world threat." Sergeant Martinez, who had previously questioned Maria's ammunition estimates, suddenly looked pale as he asked, "Sir, what's our current defensive posture? Are we prepared for an actual attack?" Before Harrison could respond, the base alarm system activated with the distinctive wailing tone that every soldier recognized as the signal for genuine emergency rather than training drill. The sound cut through the conference room like a blade, instantly transforming the atmosphere from nervous uncertainty to controlled panic. "All personnel to emergency stations," came the announcement over the base public address system. "This is not a drill. Repeat, this is not a drill. Unknown hostile forces have been detected approaching the base perimeter." The conference room exploded into controlled chaos as officers and enlisted personnel rushed toward their assigned emergency positions. But Maria noticed something that sent chills down her spine. Several of the younger soldiers were moving with the confused, disorganized urgency of people who had trained for this moment, but never truly believed it would happen. Private Morrison, who had spent months mocking Maria's preparation and attention to detail, was standing frozen near the exit with his hands shaking as he tried to remember the emergency procedures he'd practiced but never taken seriously. His earlier bravado had evaporated completely, replaced by the raw terror of someone who suddenly realized that his life might depend on skills he'd never bothered to master. "Where are we supposed to go?" Morrison asked, his voice cracking with panic. "I can't remember my emergency assignment. We never practiced this for real." Specialist Rodriguez was in slightly better shape, but her face had gone white as she fumbled with her equipment. trying to recall procedures that had seemed like pointless bureaucracy just hours earlier. The ammunition depot, right? Or was that just for training? God, I can't think straight. Maria watched this chaos unfold with the detached clarity of someone who had experienced genuine combat emergencies. While others panicked and struggled to remember their training, she moved with calm efficiency toward her assigned position, her muscle memory activated by the familiar adrenaline surge that accompanied real threats. But as she reached the supply depot, Maria encountered something that stopped her cold. Master Sergeant Kim was waiting for her, but she wasn't alone. Standing beside her was a man Maria didn't recognize, tall, weathered, wearing civilian clothes but carrying himself with the unmistakable bearing of someone with extensive military experience. "Santos," Kim said, her voice urgent but controlled. "This is Colonel James Mitchell, retired. He's here under special authorization from CENTCOM." Mitchell stepped forward, extending his hand with the confident grip of someone accustomed to command. "Staff Sergeant Santos, I've been reviewing your service record from Afghanistan. We need to talk." Maria shook his hand while trying to process this unexpected development. "Sir, I'm assigned to supply operations. My emergency station is—" "Your emergency station is wherever I tell you it is," Mitchell interrupted, but not unkindly. "Santos, the attack on this base isn't random. Intelligence suggests it's specifically designed to test our response to asymmetric threats using personnel with extensive combat experience." He gestured toward a map of the base that had been spread across a nearby table. "The enemy forces know our standard defensive procedures because they've been studying our training exercises for months. They're counting on us to respond exactly as we've been trained, using predictable tactics and conventional defensive positions." Maria studied the map, her mind automatically identifying the same vulnerabilities she'd noticed during her nighttime reconnaissance. "Sir, if they know our procedures, then they'll be expecting us to establish defensive positions according to standard doctrine. They'll know where our observation posts are located and which routes we'll use for resupply and reinforcement." Mitchell smiled grimly. "Exactly. Which is why we need someone who can think outside standard doctrine, someone who's actually commanded defensive operations under combat conditions, someone who knows how to adapt when the textbook solutions aren't adequate." The implications of what Mitchell was suggesting hit Maria like a physical blow. He wasn't just asking for her input or advice, he was asking her to take active command of defensive operations against an enemy force that had been specifically chosen to exploit conventional military thinking. "Sir," Maria said carefully, "I'm a supply sergeant. I haven't held command authority in 3 years. There are officers on this base with current tactical certifications and recent leadership experience." Kim stepped forward, her expression intense. "Santos, those officers are good people, but they've never faced an enemy that wasn't playing by the same rules they learned in school. This attack is being conducted by forces that understand how we think, how we train, and how we respond to threats." She pointed to the map, indicating several positions around the base perimeter. "The enemy is counting on us to be predictable, to follow procedures that work against conventional threats, but fail against adaptive opponents. They've studied our base defense plans, our communication protocols, and our standard operating procedures." Mitchell picked up the explanation. "What they haven't studied is you, Santos. Your combat record shows adaptability under pressure, creative problem-solving in impossible situations, and the ability to command respect from troops who initially doubted your capabilities." Maria felt the familiar weight of command responsibility settling on her shoulders, but this time it was complicated by years of self-doubt and the psychological trauma that had led to her transfer to logistics. "Sir, with respect, there are reasons I'm not in a combat leadership position. Medical reasons, psychological evaluations that suggested—" "I've read those evaluations," Mitchell interrupted. "I've also read the classified after-action reports. From your deployments. The psychological trauma you experienced wasn't from inability to handle combat stress. It was from being forced to make impossible decisions that saved lives, that violated your personal moral code. He pulled out a folder that Maria recognized with a sick feeling in her stomach. It contained reports from the night at FOB Charlie, including details that she'd tried for years to forget. You called in artillery strikes on your own position to break up an enemy assault, Mitchell continued. You made the decision to sacrifice equipment and supplies to save personnel. You chose to risk court-martial charges rather than follow orders that would have resulted in unnecessary casualties. Maria's hands began to shake as memories she'd worked hard to suppress came flooding back. The sound of incoming mortar rounds, the weight of command decisions that affected whether soldiers lived or died, the crushing responsibility of being the person everyone looked to when everything went wrong. "Sir," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I can't do that again. I can't be responsible for other people's lives when my judgment might be compromised by what happened before." Kim stepped closer, her voice gentle but firm. "Santos, your judgment isn't compromised. Your conscience is intact. That's exactly why we need you to take command when conventional leadership isn't adequate." The base alarm continued to wail, punctuated by radio chatter that suggested the situation was deteriorating rapidly. Through the depot windows, Maria could see soldiers running toward defensive positions with the kind of urgent, barely controlled movement that indicated genuine emergency rather than training exercise. "The attack begins in approximately 2 hours, Mitchell said, checking his watch. "The enemy forces are currently in final staging positions, waiting for optimal conditions to begin their assault. We have that long to prepare a defense that they won't be expecting." Maria looked at the map again, her combat-trained mind automatically beginning to analyze terrain, identify firing positions, and calculate fields of fire. Despite her fears and reservations, the tactical part of her brain was already working on problems that had no textbook solutions. "What about the current base commander?" she asked. "Lieutenant Colonel Harrison has authority over defensive operations." Mitchell's expression grew more serious. "Harrison is a good officer, but his experience is limited to conventional operations against conventional enemies. This attack is being conducted by forces that specialize in exploiting exactly the kind of thinking that conventional training produces." The sound of helicopter engines filled the air, followed by radio reports that confirmed Maria's worst fears. The enemy forces weren't just conducting a probe or reconnaissance. They were beginning a full-scale assault designed to test every aspect of the base's defensive capabilities. Outside the depot, Maria could see the soldiers who had mocked her preparation and questioned her competence now struggling to remember procedures they'd practiced but never truly mastered. The real test was beginning, and everyone who had dismissed her expertise was about to discover what combat leadership actually required. The situation deteriorated with frightening speed as radio reports confirmed what Maria had suspected during her nighttime reconnaissance. The helicopter engines she'd heard weren't medical evacuation aircraft or reinforcements. They were enemy insertion platforms, delivering assault teams to positions that had been carefully selected to exploit weaknesses in Fort Blackwood's defensive perimeter. Colonel Mitchell's radio crackled with urgent communications from observation posts around the base. "Control, this is OP-7. We have visual confirmation of at least 12 personnel in full combat gear moving through the northeast sector. They're using night vision and tactical communication equipment that's definitely not standard training gear." Another voice broke through the static. "Control, OP-3 reporting. The enemy forces appear to be using our own communication frequencies. They're jamming our primary channels and broadcasting false information to confuse our response coordination." Maria listened to these reports with the sinking realization that her worst fears were being confirmed. The attacking forces weren't just well-equipped and professionally trained. They had intimate knowledge of Fort Blackwood's communication protocols, defensive positions, and standard operating procedures. This wasn't a random attack or a training exercise gone wrong. It was a carefully planned assault designed to exploit every weakness in conventional military thinking. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison's voice came over the command frequency. But even through the radio static, Maria could hear the strain of someone trying to maintain control of a situation that was spiraling beyond his experience. All units, this is Base Command. Implement Defense Plan Alpha. Repeat, Defense Plan Alpha is now in effect. Mitchell looked at Maria with an expression that combined urgency with grim understanding. Defense Plan Alpha is exactly what they're expecting us to implement. It's the textbook response to a conventional attack, which means they've already planned countermeasures for every aspect of our standard defensive procedures. Maria studied the tactical display Mitchell had spread across the supply depot table, her mind automatically processing the information with skills that had been dormant for 3 years, but were now flooding back with terrifying clarity. The enemy positions, as reported by observation posts, formed a pattern that she recognized from her Afghanistan deployments, a classic encirclement strategy designed to isolate defensive positions and prevent mutual support between units. "Sir," she said, pointing to several locations on the map, "if they're following this pattern, their next move will be to establish fire support positions here, here, and here. They'll use those positions to suppress our observation posts while assault teams move through these corridors." She traced her finger along routes that conventional defensive planning would have considered secondary threats. "Our current defensive positions are designed to repel frontal assaults along the main approaches, but they're vulnerable to infiltration through these areas that we've classified as impassable terrain." Mitchell nodded grimly. "That's exactly the kind of analysis we need. Harrison is a good officer, but he's implementing procedures that assume the enemy will fight according to the same rules we learned in military schools. These attackers specialize in exploiting exactly those assumptions." Master Sergeant Kim had been monitoring radio communications from multiple sources, and her expression was growing increasingly concerned. "Colonel, we're getting reports of coordinated attacks on communications infrastructure. They're not just jamming our radios, they're physically cutting landlines and disrupting satellite communications." The implications hit Maria immediately. They're isolating us from higher headquarters and preventing us from calling for reinforcements. This isn't just an attack on the base. It's designed to test our ability to operate independently when all our normal support systems have been compromised. Through the depot windows, Maria could see soldiers running toward their assigned defensive positions, but their movements lacked the smooth coordination that should have characterized a well-trained military unit responding to an emergency. Instead, she observed the jerky, uncertain actions of people who were trying to remember procedures they'd practiced but never truly internalized. Private Morrison stumbled past the window, carrying equipment that was clearly not properly secured, and moving with the obvious panic of someone who had never faced genuine danger. Behind him, Specialist Rodriguez was shouting questions at Corporal Reeves, who was consulting a notebook while trying to remember his emergency assignment. "They're not ready for this," Maria said, more to herself than to Mitchell and Kim. "Most of these soldiers have never experienced actual combat. They're trying to implement training they received in classroom settings against an enemy that's adapting in real time to everything we do." Mitchell's radio erupted with urgent traffic that confirmed Maria's assessment. "Control, this is Delta Company. We're taking effective fire from positions that aren't supposed to exist according to our intelligence reports. The enemy is using weapons and tactics that suggest professional military training." Another voice broke through the chaos. "Control, this is Bravo Company. Our communication equipment is being jammed by sophisticated electronic warfare systems. We can barely maintain contact with our own squads, much less coordinate with other units. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison's voice came back over the radio, but now it carried the strain of someone who was beginning to realize that his standard procedures weren't adequate for the situation he was facing. All units maintain defensive positions and await further orders. Do not deviate from assigned sectors without authorization. Maria winced at Harrison's instructions. In her experience, rigid adherence to predetermined plans was exactly the wrong response when facing an adaptive enemy that specialized in exploiting predictable behavior. But she also understood that Harrison was falling back on the only training he'd received for situations like this. "Colonel," she said to Mitchell, with respect, "sir, I need to understand exactly what authority you're operating under." Lieutenant Colonel Harrison is the base commander, and he's implementing defensive procedures according to established doctrine. If you're asking me to contradict his orders, I need to know under what legal framework that would be justified. Mitchell pulled out a document that bore official seals and signatures Maria didn't recognize. "This is an emergency authorization from CENTCOM, giving me temporary command authority over base defense operations when conventional command structures prove inadequate against asymmetric threats." Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. He handed her the document, which was filled with legal language that essentially gave Mitchell the authority to supersede normal chain of command when facing enemies that operated outside conventional military parameters. Santos, this authorization specifically names you as the designated tactical advisor for operations requiring unconventional defensive strategies. Maria stared at the document, trying to process the implications of what Mitchell was telling her. Someone at the highest levels of military command had anticipated exactly this scenario and had prepared legal frameworks that would allow experienced combat veterans to take control when conventional leadership proved insufficient. "Sir," she said carefully, "this suggests that attacks like this one have been anticipated and planned for. Are you telling me that someone knew Fort Blackwood would be targeted by forces specifically designed to exploit our standard defensive procedures?" Kim stepped forward, her expression grim. "Santos, intelligence reports over the past 6 months have identified a pattern of probing attacks against military installations. Each attack has been designed to test different aspects of our defensive capabilities and identify weaknesses in our response procedures." She pointed to a folder filled with classified reports that Maria hadn't seen before. The attackers aren't random terrorist groups or conventional enemy forces. They're professional military personnel with extensive training in asymmetric warfare, operating under the direction of someone who understands American military doctrine well enough to exploit its weaknesses. The radio chatter was becoming increasingly frantic as defending units reported situations that didn't match their training scenarios. "Control, this is Alpha Company. The enemy is using our own supply routes to move personnel and equipment. They seem to know our base layout better than some of our own people. Control, this is Charlie Company. We're observing enemy forces in positions that our intelligence reports indicated were impassable. They're operating with equipment and tactics that suggest extensive reconnaissance of our defensive preparations." Maria listened to these reports with growing understanding of the scope of the challenge they were facing. The attacking forces weren't just well-trained and well-equipped. They had been specifically prepared to exploit every aspect of Fort Blackwood's defensive capabilities and standard operating procedures. "Colonel," she said to Mitchell, "if they know our procedures this well, then they've probably studied the personnel files of key individuals on this base. They know which officers are likely to make which decisions under pressure." Mitchell nodded. "That's exactly right. Which is why we need someone whose combat record isn't part of the standard personnel database. Someone whose tactical thinking wasn't shaped by the same military schools that produced our current leadership." The implications of what he was suggesting hit Maria with full force. The attacking forces had studied Fort Blackwood's defenses so thoroughly that they could predict how conventional military leadership would respond to various scenarios. But they hadn't studied her because her real combat experience was buried in classified files that weren't accessible through normal intelligence channels. "Sir," she said, her voice stronger now as she began to understand her role in this situation. "If you're right about their intelligence preparation, then they're counting on us to respond according to doctrine they've already analyzed and prepared countermeasures for." She pointed to the tactical display, indicating several positions that conventional wisdom would have considered secure. "They know we'll establish defensive positions here, here, and here. They know we'll use these communication frequencies and these supply routes. They've probably wargamed dozens of scenarios based on how they expect us to respond." Mitchell smiled grimly. "Now you're thinking like the combat leader I need, rather than the supply sergeant you've been pretending to be for the past 3 years." Outside the depot, the sounds of battle were growing closer. Automatic weapons fire echoed across the base, punctuated by the distinctive crack of sniper rifles and the heavier explosions of what sounded like breaching charges. The enemy forces weren't just probing the defenses. They were beginning a coordinated assault designed to overwhelm multiple positions simultaneously. "The attack is entering its active phase," Mitchell said, checking his watch. "Harrison's defensive plan will hold for maybe 30 minutes against conventional attackers, but these forces are designed to exploit the exact tactics he's implementing." Maria looked at the map again, her mind now fully engaged with the tactical problem, despite her lingering reservations about accepting command responsibility. "If we're going to stop them, we need to do things they're not expecting. We need to abandon conventional defensive positions and create new ones in locations they haven't studied." Kim handed her a radio headset. "Santos, half the soldiers on this base have been making jokes about your competence for months. The other half don't know you well enough to trust your tactical judgment. How do you plan to establish command authority over people who've been dismissing your capabilities?" Maria clipped the radio to her equipment harness and adjusted the headset, feeling the familiar weight of communication gear that had once been as natural to her as breathing. "Master Sergeant, I'm not going to establish command authority through speeches or explanations. I'm going to establish it by saving their lives when their current tactics fail." The radio crackled with increasingly desperate communications from defensive positions that were beginning to realize their standard procedures weren't adequate for the threat they were facing. The real test was about to begin, and Maria Santos was preparing to remind everyone exactly what kind of leader she had always been. The first major breakthrough came at 11:47 hours, when the enemy forces demonstrated exactly the kind of tactical sophistication Maria had been dreading. A coordinated assault on the base's eastern perimeter caught the defending troops completely off guard, not because they weren't watching for an attack, but because the enemy approached from directions that conventional military wisdom had deemed impossible. "Control, this is Echo Company." Lieutenant Walsh's voice came over the radio, high-pitched with panic and disbelief. "We're taking fire from the maintenance compound. That's supposed to be a secure area behind our defensive lines." Maria grabbed the radio from Mitchell's hand, her command voice emerging for the first time in 3 years with all the authority that had once made seasoned soldiers follow her orders without question. "Echo Company, this is Santos. What's your ammunition status, and can you maintain your current position?" There was a moment of confused silence before Walsh responded, his voice cracking with the strain of combat he'd never experienced before. "Santos, what are you doing on command frequency? We need to talk to someone with actual authority." "Lieutenant," Maria's voice cut through the radio chatter like steel, "I am talking to you. Report your tactical situation immediately, or I'll assume your position has been overrun and adjust our defensive plan accordingly." The change in her tone and bearing was so dramatic that even Mitchell and Kim stared at her with new understanding. This wasn't the quiet supply sergeant who had endured months of mockery and dismissal. This was the combat leader who had held defensive positions against overwhelming odds in Afghanistan, speaking with the absolute confidence of someone who had commanded respect in situations where hesitation meant death. Walsh's response came back immediately, his training overriding his confusion about who was giving him orders. "We're down to 60% ammunition, taking effective fire from 3 directions, and we've got 2 wounded who need immediate medical evacuation. Enemy forces are using the underground utility tunnels to move between buildings." Maria was already studying the base schematic, her mind processing tactical information with the speed that had kept her soldiers alive during multiple deployments. "Echo Company, you're going to execute a fighting withdrawal to Building 7. Use smoke grenades to cover your movement and establish overwatch positions on the 2nd floor. Do you copy?" "But Building 7 isn't a designated defensive position," Walsh protested. "Our orders are to hold the perimeter at all costs." Maria's voice carried the edge of someone who had made life-and-death decisions under fire and wouldn't tolerate debate during combat operations. "Lieutenant, your perimeter is already compromised. Execute my orders or watch your people get killed trying to hold positions the enemy has already flanked." While Walsh's unit began their withdrawal, Maria turned to Mitchell with the focused intensity of someone who had accepted command, responsibility, and was now fully committed to the mission. "Colonel, I need real-time intelligence on enemy movements and immediate authority to redirect defensive operations. Harrison's plan is failing because it's based on assumptions that don't match the tactical reality we're facing." Mitchell handed her an encrypted communication device that connected directly to the base's intelligence center. "You have full tactical command authority. Harrison is still overall base commander, but all defensive operations now fall under your direction." The radio crackled with reports from other defensive positions that confirmed Maria's assessment of how rapidly the situation was deteriorating. Sergeant Martinez's voice came through, tight with the kind of controlled fear that came from suddenly realizing that training scenarios bore little resemblance to actual combat. "Control, this is the Delta section. We're observing enemy personnel using our own vehicles to move supplies and reinforcements. They've got our radio frequencies, our vehicle identification codes, and they seem to know our standard operating procedures better than we do." Maria keyed her radio immediately. "Delta section, this is command. Switch to alternate frequency 7 and implement radio silence protocols until further notice. Assume all primary communication channels have been compromised." She turned to Kim with urgency that reflected the rapidly evolving tactical situation. "Master Sergeant, I need you to coordinate with all section leaders to switch to backup communication systems and implement irregular patrol patterns. The enemy is using our own procedures against us, so we need to abandon everything they might have studied." Kim nodded and began working her own radio, but her expression showed the concern of someone who understood exactly how difficult it would be to coordinate defensive operations when standard procedures had been compromised. "Santos, most of these soldiers have never operated without their normal communication protocols. You're asking them to improvise under combat conditions when they're already operating beyond their experience level." Before Maria could respond, the depot windows exploded inward as automatic weapons fire raked the building from multiple directions. The 3 of them dropped to the floor as bullets shattered equipment and scattered papers across the room, the distinctive crack of high-velocity rounds mixing with the heavier thuds of bullets striking concrete walls. "They've identified the command post," Mitchell shouted over the gunfire. "We need to relocate immediately before they bring in heavy weapons or explosives." Maria was already moving, gathering essential communication equipment while mentally calculating which routes would provide the best cover for movement to an alternate position. Colonel, we need to establish a mobile command post. Static positions are exactly what they're expecting us to use. As they prepared to evacuate the depot, Maria's radio crackled with a transmission that made her blood run cold. It was Private Morrison, the soldier who had spent months mocking her competence, now speaking with the desperate tone of someone who had suddenly realized his life depended on skills he'd never bothered to master. Control, this is... I don't know my call sign. This is Morrison from Bravo Section. We're pinned down in the motor pool, and we can't reach our assigned defensive position. The enemy cut us off, and we don't know what to do. Maria grabbed her radio while bullets continued to impact the building around them. Morrison, this is Santos. Can you reach the maintenance shed behind your current position? There was a moment of shocked silence before Morrison responded, his voice cracking with panic and disbelief. Santos, you're not supposed to be giving orders. We need to talk to a real officer. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on Maria, but she didn't have time for explanations or hurt feelings. Morrison, you can argue about my qualifications after we keep you alive. Move to the maintenance shed immediately and establish defensive positions covering the approaches from the east. But that's not where we're supposed to be, Morrison protested. Our orders were to hold the motor pool. Maria's voice carried the absolute authority of someone who had commanded troops under fire and wouldn't tolerate insubordination during combat operations. Private, your assigned position is compromised, and holding it will get you killed. Move to the maintenance shed now, or explain to your family why you chose to follow obsolete orders instead of staying alive. The gunfire outside intensified. Enemy forces began using heavier weapons to suppress defensive positions throughout the base. Maria led Mitchell and Kim through a series of covered routes she'd identified during her years of studying the base layout, moving with the tactical awareness that had kept her alive during urban combat operations in Afghanistan. As they established a new command post in the base communication center, Maria began implementing defensive strategies that violated every aspect of conventional military doctrine, but were perfectly suited to the unconventional threat they were facing. Instead of trying to hold predetermined defensive lines, she ordered units to establish mobile strong points that could provide mutual support while maintaining the flexibility to relocate when enemy forces adapted to their positions. All units. This is command, she transmitted over the secure frequency. Abandon fixed defensive positions and implement hunter-killer teams. Enemy forces are using our own procedures against us, so we're going to operate in ways they haven't studied. The response from various unit leaders reflected the confusion of soldiers who were being asked to abandon everything they'd learned about defensive operations. Sergeant Martinez's voice came back immediately. Command, that's not standard procedure. We're supposed to maintain defensive integrity along established perimeters. Maria's response was patient but firm, drawing on years of experience in explaining tactical necessity to soldiers who had been trained to follow procedures rather than adapt to changing circumstances. Sergeant, standard procedures assume we're fighting an enemy that follows the same rules we do. This enemy has studied our procedures and prepared countermeasures for everything we're supposed to do. Lieutenant Walsh's voice joined the conversation, still carrying the strain of someone operating beyond his comfort zone, but beginning to understand the tactical reality they were facing. Command, Echo Company has established positions in Building 7 as ordered. We're observing enemy movement patterns that suggest they expected us to remain in our original defensive positions. Maria smiled grimly as she monitored the tactical display that showed enemy forces moving into positions that would have been perfect for attacking conventional defensive perimeters, but were now exposed to observation and fire from the unconventional positions she'd ordered her units to occupy. All units, she transmitted. The enemy spent months studying how we would respond to various attack scenarios. They're implementing assault plans based on defensive positions we're no longer occupying. We're going to use their intelligence preparation against them by being where they don't expect us to be. The transformation in the tactical situation was immediate and dramatic. Enemy forces that had been operating with the confidence of troops, executing a well-rehearsed plan, suddenly found themselves engaging defensive positions that didn't exist in their intelligence reports, facing resistance from directions they hadn't anticipated, and dealing with communication disruptions that interfered with their coordination. Maria's radio crackled with reports that confirmed her tactical assessment was working. "Command, this is Delta Section. Enemy forces are moving through areas where they expected to encounter our defensive positions. They're exposed, and we have clear fields of fire. Command, this is Bravo Section. The enemy seems confused about our current positions. They're using radio frequencies and communication protocols based on defensive plans we've abandoned." For the first time since the attack began, Maria allowed herself a moment of cautious optimism. The soldiers who had spent months questioning her competence were now following her orders with the trust that came from seeing tactical expertise demonstrated under fire. The battle was far from over, but the initiative was beginning to shift. The tactical momentum began shifting dramatically as Maria's unconventional defensive strategy started producing results that surprised even the most experienced soldiers. On the base, enemy forces that had been operating with textbook precision suddenly found themselves stumbling into carefully prepared ambush positions that didn't exist in any of the intelligence reports they'd studied for months. Private Morrison's voice came over the radio with a tone of amazement that replaced his earlier panic. "Command, this is Morrison from the maintenance shed. We've got eyes on an enemy squad moving through the motor pool area. They're acting like they expected to find our people there, but they're walking right into our fields of fire." Maria keyed her radio while studying the tactical display that showed enemy movements throughout the base. "Morrison, hold your fire until they commit to their current route. Let them get deeper into the kill zone before you engage." "But shouldn't we stop them now while we have the advantage?" Morrison asked, his voice still carrying uncertainty about tactical decisions that went against his limited training. Maria's response demonstrated the kind of tactical thinking that had earned her respect from Special Forces officers during her Afghanistan deployments. "Morrison, if we engage now, we eliminate one squad but alert other enemy forces that we've changed our defensive positions. If we wait, we can eliminate multiple squads and maintain the element of surprise for future engagements." Colonel Mitchell, monitoring the radio traffic from their new command post, looked at Maria with the expression of someone who was beginning to understand exactly what kind of tactical mind he was working with. "Santos, you're not just adapting to their attack patterns, you're using their intelligence preparation against them by deliberately exploiting the assumptions they made about our defensive capabilities." Maria nodded while coordinating with multiple unit commanders through her headset. "Colonel, they spent months studying our standard operating procedures and developing attack plans based on predictable defensive responses. But those same intelligence reports that gave them an advantage are now working against them because they're committed to assault routes and timing sequences based on defensive positions we've abandoned." The radio crackled with more reports that confirmed how effectively her strategy was disrupting enemy operations. Sergeant Martinez's voice came through with excitement that barely concealed his amazement at what was happening. "Command, this is Delta Section. Enemy forces are using communication protocols and coordination signals that suggest they're trying to coordinate with defensive positions that no longer exist. They're getting confused about our response patterns." Master Sergeant Kim, who had been monitoring enemy radio frequencies, looked up from her equipment with information that explained exactly how Maria's tactics were affecting the attacking forces. "Santos, we're intercepting enemy communications that show significant confusion about our current defensive posture. They're requesting clarification about target locations and reporting that our response patterns don't match their intelligence preparation." Maria allowed herself a moment of satisfaction as she realized that her decision to abandon conventional defensive thinking was producing exactly the kind of tactical confusion that could turn the tide of a battle. Master Sergeant, their whole attack plan was based on our predictability. By becoming unpredictable, we've forced them to operate without the intelligence advantage they've been counting on. Lieutenant Walsh's voice joined the conversation with a tone that reflected growing confidence in the unconventional tactics he was being asked to implement. Command, this is Echo Company. We're observing enemy forces attempting to establish fire support positions based on defensive locations we evacuated hours ago. Should we engage or continue to let them commit to positions that won't give them the advantages they're expecting? The question demonstrated exactly the kind of tactical thinking Maria had been hoping to encourage soldiers who were beginning to understand that combat effectiveness came from adaptability rather than rigid adherence to predetermined procedures. Echo Company, maintain observation and prepare to engage on my command. We're going to let them establish positions that they think are advantageous but are actually exposing them to coordinated fire from multiple directions. While coordinating these defensive operations, Maria noticed something that made her reconsider her assessment of the enemy force's capabilities. Their confusion about changed defensive positions was genuine, but their adaptation to unexpected circumstances was faster and more professional than she'd initially anticipated. Colonel, she said to Mitchell while studying intercepted communications, these aren't just well-trained soldiers following a predetermined plan. They're professional military personnel with extensive experience in adaptive tactics. Their initial confusion is giving way to real-time tactical adjustments that suggest command-level expertise. Mitchell's expression grew more serious as he processed the implications of what Maria was telling him. Are you saying they're learning from our defensive changes and adapting their assault tactics accordingly? Maria pointed to the tactical display where enemy movement patterns were beginning to show signs of sophisticated tactical thinking. Sir, their initial attack was based on intelligence preparation and predetermined assault routes. But now they're conducting real-time reconnaissance and adjusting their tactics based on our actual defensive positions rather than their assumptions about where we should be. The radio crackled with reports that confirmed Maria's assessment of how the enemy forces were adapting to the changed tactical situation. Corporal Reeves's voice came through with information that demonstrated the professional competence of the attacking forces. Command, this is Alpha Section. Enemy forces have established new observation posts and are conducting systematic reconnaissance of our actual defensive positions. They're not just following their original plan anymore, they're adapting to what we're actually doing. Maria felt the familiar tightness in her chest that had always accompanied moments in combat when the tactical situation was evolving faster than anyone could completely control. All units, enemy forces are beginning to adapt to our defensive changes. Maintain current positions, but be prepared to implement secondary relocation procedures if they begin coordinated assaults based on our actual locations. Lieutenant Walsh's voice came back immediately with a question that reflected the kind of tactical thinking Maria had been hoping to develop among the base's defenders. Command, if they're adapting to our current positions, should we implement another round of position changes to maintain our unpredictability advantage? Before Maria could respond, the command post's communication equipment erupted with urgent traffic that indicated the enemy forces were implementing tactical changes of their own. Control, this is all observation posts. We're detecting coordinated enemy movement toward multiple defensive positions simultaneously. They appear to be preparing for a coordinated assault based on our current locations. Maria's mind raced through tactical options as she realized that the battle was entering a new phase, where both sides were operating beyond their original plans and relying on real-time adaptation to changing circumstances. All units implement Dispersal Pattern 3 immediately. Enemy forces are preparing coordinated assaults based on reconnaissance of our current positions. The response from various unit commanders reflected both confidence in Maria's tactical leadership and growing understanding of the complex chess game they were playing against professional opposition. Sergeant Martinez's voice came through clearly. "Command, Delta Section moving to alternate positions. We're beginning to understand how this tactical adaptation process works." Private Morrison, who had been among Maria's most vocal critics just hours earlier, transmitted with a tone that showed how combat experience was changing his perspective on leadership and competence. "Command Morrison here. We're executing movements to secondary positions, and I wanted to say that these tactics are working better than anything we learned in training." Colonel Mitchell, who had been observing Maria's command performance with the assessment skills of someone who had evaluated military leaders throughout a long career, leaned over to speak privately while she continued coordinating defensive operations. "Santos," he said quietly, "you're not just implementing unconventional tactics. You're teaching these soldiers to think tactically rather than just follow procedures. That's the kind of leadership development that can't be learned in classrooms." Maria continued coordinating radio traffic while responding to Mitchell's observation. "Colonel, most of these soldiers have never been in situations where their survival depended on their ability to adapt to changing circumstances. Combat teaches lessons that can't be conveyed through training exercises or theoretical instruction." The tactical situation continued to evolve as both sides adapted to each other's capabilities and limitations. Enemy forces were demonstrating the kind of professional competence that suggested extensive combat experience, but they were operating in an environment where their intelligence preparation had been negated by unconventional defensive thinking. Maria's radio crackled with reports that showed how the battle was becoming a genuine test of tactical leadership rather than a simple application of predetermined procedures. The soldiers who had questioned her competence were now executing complex tactical maneuvers based on real-time decisions that required exactly the kind of combat experience they'd been dismissing for months. The initiative was shifting again. But this time both sides understood they were engaged in a genuine tactical contest where adaptability and leadership would determine the outcome rather than equipment or predetermined plans. The breakthrough moment came when Maria made a discovery that changed everything about how she understood the attack on Fort Blackwood. While monitoring intercepted enemy communications, she noticed tactical terminology and coordination procedures that were distinctly American in origin, suggesting these weren't foreign military forces but highly trained personnel operating with intimate knowledge of U.S. military doctrine. "Colonel," she said to Mitchell, her voice tight with realization, "listen to this intercepted transmission." She played back a recording where enemy commanders were using the NATO phonetic alphabet, American time references, and coordination procedures that were identical to those taught in U.S. military schools. More troubling still, their tactical discussions revealed knowledge of Fort Blackwood's defensive capabilities that went far beyond what external reconnaissance could have provided. Mitchell's face went pale as he processed the implications. "Santos, are you suggesting these are American military personnel conducting this attack?" Maria pulled out the wooden box that had appeared on her desk, the one containing the memory card labeled Kandahar Fob Charlie, the Night Watch. With trembling fingers, she inserted the card into a secure tablet and accessed footage that she'd hoped never to see again. The video showed the firefight that had earned her the Bronze Star, but it also showed something else: American military advisors working with Allied forces who had later been revealed as having questionable loyalties. Among those advisors was a face that Maria now recognized from her current observations of enemy commanders. "Colonel, the leader of this assault is Captain Marcus Thompson, formerly of the 82nd Airborne. He was part of a classified program that went wrong in Afghanistan. American Special Operations personnel, who were supposed to be training Allied forces, but were actually gathering intelligence on U.S. tactical procedures for unknown purposes. Mitchell examined the footage with the expression of someone who was seeing confirmation of his worst suspicions. Santos, Thompson, and his team disappeared from a forward operating base in 2020. Intelligence assumed they'd been killed or captured, but their bodies were never recovered. The radio crackled with urgent traffic that confirmed Maria's identification. Lieutenant Walsh's voice came through with information that validated her assessment of the enemy leadership. "Command, this is Echo Company. We've identified the enemy. Commander through binoculars. He's wearing American military equipment and appears to be directing operations using U.S. tactical hand signals and coordination procedures." Maria keyed her radio immediately. "Echo Company, maintain observation, but do not engage the command element yet. I need to understand their complete tactical organization before we disrupt their command structure." The realization that they were facing rogue American military personnel explained several puzzling aspects of the attack. The enemy forces weren't just using American equipment and procedures. They were Americans who had turned their training and knowledge against their former comrades. "Colonel," Maria said, her voice carrying the weight of someone who had served alongside personnel who had later betrayed their oaths, "if Thompson is leading this assault, then they have access to classified tactical information that goes far beyond what any foreign intelligence service could have gathered." Mitchell's expression reflected the gravity of a situation that had just become infinitely more complex. "Santos, if these are American military personnel conducting unauthorized operations against U.S. installations, then we're dealing with more than just a tactical problem. This is treason, and it suggests a conspiracy that extends far beyond Fort Blackwood." The tactical implications were immediate and terrifying. Thompson's team would know not just Fort Blackwood's defensive procedures, but the tactical thinking patterns of American military leadership. They would anticipate exactly the kind of unconventional responses Maria had been implementing because they'd been trained in the same adaptive tactics she was using. "All units," Maria transmitted, "be advised that enemy forces are composed of rogue American military personnel with extensive knowledge of our tactical procedures. They will anticipate conventional responses and many unconventional ones as well. We need to operate at a level of unpredictability that goes beyond anything they've experienced." Sergeant Martinez's voice came back with a question that reflected the psychological impact of learning they were fighting former American soldiers. "Command, are you telling us we're fighting our own people? How are we supposed to deal with that?" Maria understood the emotional complexity of what she was asking her troops to accept. Fighting foreign enemies was psychologically straightforward, compared to engaging personnel who had once sworn the same oath and worn the same uniform. All units, these personnel made a choice to betray their oath and attack American military installations. They are no longer our people, they are enemies, who happen to speak English and use familiar tactics. Treat them accordingly. Private Morrison's voice joined the conversation with a tone that reflected his growing understanding of the tactical challenges they were facing. "Command, if they know our procedures as well as we do, how do we maintain any kind of tactical advantage?" The question demonstrated exactly the kind of tactical thinking Maria had been hoping to develop among Fort Blackwood's defenders. "Morrison, our advantage isn't in superior knowledge of procedures. It's in our willingness to abandon procedures when they're not effective. Thompson's team will expect us to follow doctrine because that's how they were trained to think." "Lieutenant," Walsh transmitted with information that confirmed how Maria's assessment was affecting the tactical situation. "Command, Echo Company observing enemy forces implementing textbook assault procedures designed to counter the conventional responses they're expecting us to use." Maria smiled grimly as she realized that Thompson's extensive knowledge of American tactical doctrine was actually becoming a liability for his forces. They were so confident in their understanding of how Fort Blackwood would respond that they were implementing assault plans based on assumptions that were no longer valid. All units, enemy forces are implementing assault procedures based on their expectations of how we should respond to their tactics. We're going to respond in ways that their training never prepared them for. The radio traffic that followed reflected a transformation in how Fort Blackwood's defenders were approaching the tactical challenges they faced. Instead of trying to implement procedures they'd memorized, they were beginning to think creatively about problems that had no textbook solutions. Corporal Reeves transmitted with excitement that reflected his growing confidence in unconventional tactical approaches. Command Alpha Section has identified enemy staging areas that they established based on assumptions about our response patterns. They're positioned perfectly for conventional countermeasures, but exposed to the kind of irregular tactics we're implementing. Maria coordinated the final phase of her defensive strategy with the satisfaction of someone who had turned the enemy's greatest strength, their knowledge of American military doctrine, into their greatest weakness. Thompson's forces were operating with such confidence in their understanding of American tactical thinking that they'd become predictable in their unpredictability. The battle was reaching its climax, and Maria Santos was about to demonstrate that the most dangerous enemy of rigid tactical thinking was a mind that refused to be limited by conventional wisdom, even when that conventional wisdom came from highly trained American special operations personnel. The moment of truth arrived. When Maria decided to implement a tactical maneuver that would have horrified every military instructor who had ever taught defensive operations. Instead of trying to repel Thompson's assault forces, she was going to let them penetrate the base perimeter and then systematically destroy them using their own confidence against them. All units, she transmitted over the secure frequency. Implement withdrawal to secondary defensive positions. Allow enemy forces to occupy outer perimeter buildings, but maintain observation and fields of fire for coordinated counterattack. The response from her unit commanders reflected the psychological difficulty of deliberately ceding ground to an attacking force, even when the tactical logic was sound. Lieutenant Walsh's voice came back immediately with barely controlled anxiety. Command, you're asking us to let them take buildings we've been ordered to defend. That goes against everything we've been trained to do. Maria's response carried the absolute confidence of someone who had used similar tactics to save lives in Afghanistan when conventional defensive thinking would have resulted in disaster. Lieutenant, we're not giving them buildings, we're giving them targets. They expect us to fight for every inch of ground, so they've planned their assault based on meeting resistance at the perimeter. Instead, we're going to let them commit to positions where they can't retreat or receive reinforcement. Colonel Mitchell, monitoring the tactical display, looked at Maria with an expression that combined admiration with concern about the risks she was taking. Santos, if this doesn't work, you're giving Thompson's forces control of critical infrastructure and supply points. Are you certain about this tactical decision? Maria studied the base layout one final time, visualizing how Thompson's forces would move through buildings they believed they had captured while actually walking into the most sophisticated trap she'd ever designed. Colonel, Thompson's team is operating with the confidence of people who believe they understand every possible American response to their tactics. That confidence is going to make them careless. The withdrawal began with precision that demonstrated how much Fort Blackwood's defenders had learned about adaptive tactics in just a few hours. Units that had struggled with basic coordination at the beginning of the battle were now executing complex, tactical maneuvers that required trust in their commander's judgment and faith in plans they didn't fully understand. Sergeant Martinez's voice came over the radio with information that confirmed the first phase of Maria's strategy was working exactly as planned. Command, Delta Section has withdrawn to secondary positions. Enemy forces are moving into the buildings we evacuated, and they're acting like they've achieved a major tactical victory. Maria smiled grimly as she watched enemy symbols advance. on the tactical display into positions that look strategically valuable, but were actually carefully prepared kill zones. All units, enemy forces are occupying predetermined target areas. Maintain observation and prepare for coordinated engagement on my command. Private Morrison transmitted with amazement that reflected how much his understanding of tactical thinking had evolved during the battle. Command Morrison here. The enemy is setting up defensive positions in buildings they think they've captured, but they're positioning themselves exactly where we want them to be. The transformation in Morrison's tactical awareness was emblematic of what had happened to Fort Blackwood's entire defensive force. Soldiers who had begun the day questioning Maria's competence were now implementing sophisticated, tactical concepts that they were learning in real time under combat conditions. Lieutenant Walsh's voice crackled through the radio with excitement that barely contained his amazement at how the tactical situation was developing. Command Echo Company observing enemy forces establishing command posts and supply points in buildings that give them excellent fields of fire against our former positions, but leave them completely exposed to observation and fire from our current locations. Maria keyed her radio while making final preparations for the coordinated assault that would demonstrate exactly what kind of tactical mind Thompson's forces had been underestimating. All units, enemy forces have committed to positions based on their assumptions about our defensive capabilities. They believe they've seized tactical advantage when they've actually positioned themselves for systematic destruction. The radio traffic that followed reflected the kind of tactical coordination that could only emerge from soldiers who had learned to trust their commander's judgment completely. Each unit reported readiness for operations that they might not fully understand, but had faith would succeed because they'd seen Maria's tactical expertise demonstrated under fire. Corporal Reeves transmitted with the controlled excitement of someone who was beginning to understand the full scope of the tactical operation they were implementing. Command, Alpha Section ready for coordinated engagement. Enemy forces in our sector have established positions that make them vulnerable to crossfire from multiple directions. Maria took a deep breath and activated her radio for the transmission that would either vindicate her tactical judgment or result in disaster for everyone under her command. All units, this is command. Execute coordinated assault on enemy positions. Remember, they expect us to fight like Americans because they are Americans. Fight like soldiers who refuse to be predictable. The assault began with devastating effectiveness as Thompson's forces discovered that their extensive knowledge of American tactical doctrine had become a liability rather than an advantage. They had positioned themselves to repel conventional counterattacks from directions that American forces would normally use, leaving themselves exposed to the unconventional assault routes Maria's soldiers were implementing. Command, this is Delta Section, Martinez reported with barely controlled amazement. Enemy forces are trying to respond according to standard defensive procedures, but they're defending against attacks that aren't coming from the directions they expected. Command, Echo Company here, Walsh transmitted. Enemy command element appears confused about our assault patterns. They're issuing orders based on tactical assumptions that don't match what we're actually doing. The battle reached its climax as Thompson's forces, despite their professional training and extensive combat experience, found themselves systematically outmaneuvered by defensive tactics that operated outside every parameter they had studied and prepared for. Maria coordinated the final phase of the assault with the satisfaction of someone who had proven that tactical expertise wasn't about following procedures, but about understanding when procedures needed to be abandoned in favor of creative thinking that could adapt to any situation. Captain Marcus Thompson and his rogue special operations team had made the mistake of believing that their knowledge of American military doctrine made them superior to the soldiers defending Fort Blackwood. They had failed to account for the possibility that an experienced combat leader might choose to operate outside doctrine entirely, using their own expertise against them. The aftermath of the coordinated assault revealed the complete tactical devastation that Maria's unconventional strategy had achieved. Thompson's forces, caught in positions they had believed were advantageous, found themselves systematically neutralized by defenders who had abandoned every predictable response pattern they might have anticipated. "Command, this is Delta Section," Sergeant Martinez reported, his voice carrying amazement that bordered on disbelief. "Enemy forces in our sector have been completely neutralized. They were so focused on defending against conventional assault patterns that they never established security for the routes we actually used." Lieutenant Walsh's transmission confirmed that the tactical success was base-wide rather than limited to individual sectors. "Command, Eco Company reporting all enemy positions in our area of operations have been secured." The enemy command element attempted to coordinate a fighting withdrawal, but they were using communication procedures and rally points that we were able to anticipate and counter. Maria monitored these reports while coordinating with Colonel Mitchell to ensure that Thompson himself was captured rather than killed. The intelligence value of interrogating a rogue special operations officer who had been conducting unauthorized operations against American military installations was immeasurable. "All units," she transmitted. "Priority target is the enemy commander, Captain Marcus Thompson. He's to be taken alive for intelligence purposes. All other enemy personnel are to be secured and prepared for transfer to military police custody." Private Morrison's voice came over the radio with information that demonstrated how completely Thompson's tactical assumptions had been proven wrong. "Command, Morrison here. We've secured the enemy commander. He keeps asking how we knew to abandon standard defensive procedures. Apparently, he spent months studying our base defense plans and never considered that we might not follow them." The irony wasn't lost on Maria. Thompson's extensive knowledge of American military doctrine had become his greatest weakness because he had assumed that Fort Blackwood's defenders would be limited by the same tactical thinking that he had learned. During his own military career, Master Sergeant Kim approached Maria with a folder containing preliminary intelligence gathered from captured enemy personnel. "Santos Thompson's team has been conducting similar operations against military installations across 3 states. They've been testing our defensive capabilities and identifying weaknesses in standard base security procedures." Maria reviewed the intelligence reports with a growing understanding of the scope of the conspiracy they had just disrupted. "Master Sergeant, this wasn't just an attack on Fort Blackwood. It was part of a systematic assessment of American military readiness conducted by personnel with access to classified tactical information." Colonel Mitchell joined their conversation with information that explained the broader context of what they had experienced. "Santos, preliminary interrogation of captured personnel reveals that Thompson's operation was funded and directed by a network of former American military officers who have been selling tactical intelligence to foreign governments. The implications were staggering. American special operations personnel had been using their knowledge and access to conduct operations designed to expose weaknesses in U.S. military installations, then selling that information to hostile foreign powers. "Colonel," Maria said, processing the scope of what they had uncovered, "if Thompson's team has been conducting similar operations at other bases, then our entire defensive doctrine may have been compromised. Foreign intelligence services could be planning attacks based on detailed knowledge of our standard operating procedures." Lieutenant Colonel Harrison arrived at the command post with an expression that combined relief at the successful defense with embarrassment about how his conventional defensive planning had nearly resulted in disaster. "Captain Santos," he said, using her rank for the first time since the attack began, "I owe you an apology and an explanation." Harrison gestured toward a classified folder he was carrying. 3 weeks ago, I received orders to conduct this exercise. Using our standard defensive procedures, despite intelligence reports suggesting potential security threats. I was told that adherence to doctrine was essential for maintaining operational security. Maria studied Harrison's expression and realized that Fort Blackwood's commander had been as much a victim of the conspiracy as anyone else. "Sir, you were given orders designed to ensure that our defensive response would be predictable and vulnerable to the kind of attack Thompson's team was conducting." The full scope of the conspiracy became clear as more intelligence was gathered. From captured personnel and recovered equipment, Thompson's operation had been designed to test whether American military installations could be successfully attacked by forces using American tactical knowledge against conventional defensive procedures. "Captain Santos," Harrison continued, "your decision to abandon standard defensive doctrine saved this base and potentially exposed a conspiracy that could have compromised military installations throughout the country." Sergeant Martinez approached with a report that demonstrated the scope of intelligence Thompson's team had gathered about Fort Blackwood's operations. "Ma'am, we've recovered detailed files containing our defensive plans, personnel records, training schedules, and equipment inventories. They knew everything about how we were supposed to respond to various attack scenarios." Private Morrison, who had been among Maria's most vocal critics just hours earlier, spoke with the humility of someone who had learned important lessons about judgment and respect. "Ma'am, I wanted to apologize for the things I said about your capabilities. I didn't understand that real leadership meant being able to think beyond what we learned in training." Maria looked around at the soldiers who had dismissed her expertise and were now seeking her guidance with the respect that came from seeing competence demonstrated under fire. "Morrison, the important thing isn't what you said before, it's what you learned during this operation about the difference between following procedures and thinking tactically." Lieutenant Walsh approached with information that confirmed how Maria's leadership had transformed Fort Blackwood's defensive capabilities. "Ma'am, preliminary after-action analysis shows that our casualty rate was less than 5%, despite facing professional military opposition with extensive knowledge of our standard operating procedures. The success wasn't just tactical, it was educational." Soldiers who had begun the day questioning whether Maria belonged in a military environment were now understanding that true military competence meant adapting to situations that training scenarios couldn't anticipate. Colonel Mitchell received a secure communication that provided official confirmation of what they had already suspected. Santos, CENTCOM, confirms that Thompson's operation was part of a larger intelligence gathering effort conducted by rogue American military personnel. Your tactical response not only defended this base, but provided intelligence that will be used to identify and neutralize similar threats at other installations. Master Sergeant Kim handed Maria a communication device with a message that would change her military career permanently. "Santos, you've got orders to report to the Pentagon for immediate consultation with senior military leadership about defensive procedures for unconventional threats." Maria stared at the orders while processing how completely her life had changed in the space of a single day. She had begun the morning as a supply sergeant whose competence was questioned by everyone around her, and was ending it as a tactical expert whose innovations would influence American military doctrine. The soldiers who had mocked her preparation and questioned her military credentials were now gathered around her, asking questions about tactical thinking and requesting guidance that went far beyond supply logistics. The transformation was complete, and everyone understood that they had witnessed something extraordinary. 6 months after the attack on Fort Blackwood, Maria Santos stood in a conference room at the Pentagon, briefing senior military officials on defensive strategies for unconventional threats. The woman who had once been dismissed as a supply clerk who couldn't handle real military responsibilities was now addressing generals and colonels, who hung on every word of her tactical analysis. "The fundamental weakness in our current defensive doctrine," Maria explained to the assembled officers, is the assumption that enemies will fight according to the same tactical principles we teach in our military schools. When facing adversaries with intimate knowledge of our procedures, predictability becomes our greatest vulnerability. General Patricia Hayes, the Deputy Chief of Staff for Operations, leaned forward with the intense attention of someone who understood that Maria's insights could reshape American military thinking. "Captain Santos, your report suggests that conventional base defense planning needs to be completely reconsidered. Are you recommending that we abandon decades of proven tactical doctrine?" Maria clicked to the next slide in her presentation, which showed tactical diagrams from the Fort Blackwood operation. "General, I'm recommending that we maintain our proven procedures as a foundation, but develop adaptive capabilities that allow commanders to deviate from doctrine when facing enemies who have studied our standard responses." The transformation in how military leadership viewed Maria's expertise was complete and permanent. Officers who would have dismissed her opinions 6 months earlier were now taking detailed notes and asking for clarification about tactical concepts that challenged everything they had learned about defensive operations back at Fort Blackwood. The changes in base culture were equally dramatic. The supply depot where Maria had once worked in isolation had been converted into a tactical training center where soldiers from multiple installations came to learn adaptive defensive procedures. Young officers who had never questioned conventional military thinking were now studying scenarios that required creative problem-solving rather than procedural compliance. Private Morrison, now promoted to specialist, was conducting a tour for visiting personnel from other bases. His presentation demonstrated how completely his understanding of military competence had evolved since the attack. "The most important lesson we learned," Morrison told the group of young soldiers, "is that real military expertise isn't about memorizing procedures. It's about understanding when those procedures need to be abandoned in favor of tactical thinking that adapts to whatever situation you're facing." Lieutenant Walsh, now a captain after his exemplary performance during the crisis, had been assigned to develop training curricula based on the tactical innovations Maria had implemented. His office was filled with analysis reports and tactical studies that were reshaping how the Army approached unconventional threats. "What Captain Santos taught us," Walsh explained to a group of visiting officers, "is that the enemy's greatest advantage can become their greatest weakness if you're willing to operate outside their expectations." Thompson's team knew everything about our standard procedures, but they had no preparation for tactics that abandoned those procedures entirely. Sergeant Martinez, promoted to staff sergeant for his leadership during the battle, was now running tactical exercises that challenged soldiers to think beyond conventional responses. His training scenarios were designed to present problems that had no textbook solutions, forcing participants to develop the kind of adaptive thinking that had saved Fort Blackwood. "The thing about working with Captain Santos," Martinez told a group of NCOs from other installations, "is that she never asked us to follow her orders blindly. She explained the tactical reasoning behind every decision, so we learned to think tactically instead of just following procedures." Master Sergeant Kim had been selected to oversee the implementation of adaptive defensive training throughout the military, traveling to bases across the country to share the lessons learned from Fort Blackwood's successful defense against professional opposition. Captain Santos proved that tactical expertise isn't about rank or position, Kim explained during a briefing at Fort Lewis. "It's about the ability to see solutions that aren't obvious, to adapt when standard approaches aren't effective, and to earn trust through demonstrated competence rather than assumed authority." The ripple effects of Maria's tactical innovations extended far beyond military circles. Defense contractors were studying her adaptive procedures to develop training systems that could prepare soldiers for unconventional threats. Military academies were incorporating case studies from the Fort Blackwood operation into their curricula, challenging future officers to think beyond doctrinal limitations. Colonel Mitchell, now assigned to the Joint Chiefs of Staff, was overseeing a comprehensive review of base security procedures that incorporated lessons learned from Thompson's operation and Maria's response. His reports were influencing military policy at the highest levels of government. What Captain Santos demonstrated at Fort Blackwood, Mitchell wrote in a classified assessment, is that our greatest defense against enemies who know our procedures is leaders who understand when those procedures must be discarded in favor of tactical creativity. Maria herself had been promoted to major and assigned to a special operations command where her expertise in unconventional tactics was being applied to offensive operations as well as defensive planning. Her office was filled with requests from commanders facing tactical challenges that required solutions beyond conventional military thinking. But the most meaningful change was in how soldiers throughout the military viewed the concept of hidden expertise. The story of Fort Blackwood had spread through military circles, creating awareness that competence and capability weren't always visible in someone's current assignment or apparent responsibilities. Young soldiers who might have dismissed experienced personnel based on their current positions were now asking questions and seeking guidance from anyone who might have knowledge to share. The casual cruelty that had characterized interactions between different ranks and specialties was being replaced by professional curiosity about what each person might be capable of contributing. Private Morrison, reflecting on his experience during a recent interview for a military publication, captured the essence of what Fort Blackwood had taught everyone involved. We learned that the person you're dismissing today might be the person whose expertise saves your life tomorrow. Captain Santos taught us that real strength comes from recognizing capability wherever it exists, not just where we expect to find it. The iron Raphael model that had once sat on Maria's supply depot desk was now displayed in the Fort Blackwood Visitor Center, accompanied by a plaque that read, "In honor of all military personnel whose true capabilities remain hidden until the moment when their expertise is desperately needed." Maria's story had become legend, but more importantly, it had become a lesson that changed how an entire military organization thought about competence, leadership, and the dangerous assumptions people make about the capabilities of those around them. The quiet supply sergeant who had endured months of mockery and dismissal had proven that legends don't always announce themselves. Sometimes they simply wait patiently for the moment when their true nature can no longer be ignored. 3 years later, Maria received an unexpected package at her Pentagon office. Inside was a weathered wooden box, identical to the one that had appeared on her desk at Fort Blackwood. This time, it contained a photograph of young soldiers at various military installations, all wearing patches that read, "Santos Tactical Initiative." The accompanying note was handwritten. "Ma'am, we're the second generation of soldiers trained in adaptive tactics. Your methods are now standard curriculum at West Point, and every base defense plan includes protocols for abandoning doctrine when facing unconventional threats. But more importantly, we've learned to see potential in everyone around us, regardless of their current assignment." Lieutenant Morrison, Commanding Officer, 3rd Tactical Innovation Company. Maria smiled as she realized her greatest victory hadn't been defeating Thompson's forces or exposing the conspiracy. It was changing how an entire generation of military personnel thought about hidden potential and the danger of underestimating anyone based on their job title alone. Her desk phone rang with another call from a base commander facing an unconventional threat, seeking guidance that went beyond standard operating procedures. As she reached for the phone, Maria noticed her reflection in the window, no longer the dismissed supply clerk, but not quite the same combat leader from Afghanistan either. She had become something new, a bridge between conventional military thinking and the adaptive leadership that modern threats demanded. Sometimes, the most important battles aren't won with weapons or tactics, but by proving that extraordinary capabilities can exist in the most ordinary places, waiting for the moment when they're desperately needed. What did you think of Maria's incredible transformation? Have you ever underestimated someone who later proved their true worth? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story of hidden potential and tactical brilliance, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell for more incredible true stories of unsung heroes who changed everything when it mattered most. Your support helps us bring you the most amazing stories of courage, leadership, and the power of never giving up on yourself.